Funding for this program provided by the members of KRWG. Become a member anytime online at krwg.org. Chamber funding provided by the Las Cruces Sun News, Bohannon Houston, and the Las Cruces Bulletin.
Thank you so much for joining us for the Chamber Economic Forum, and a special thanks to our members who make local programming possible. I'm very pleased to welcome back into our studios once again our economist from New Mexico State University, Dr. Jim Peach, Dr. Chris Erickson, and Dr. Ken Martin. Gentlemen, thank you for volunteering your time to share your expertise today. We really appreciate it. We're going to begin with Dr. Jim Peach, and he's going to be talking about the condition of the national economy and what it looks like for the future. Dr. Peach.
Thank you, Brad. And thanks to KRWG and the Chamber for letting us do this again. The U.S. economy is in a recovery. It's not nearly as robust as many of us would like. If we were to look at the consensus forecast, we'd have real GDP growth in 2011 of just about 3.1%. And I look at about 10 different forecasts. These include the Congressional Budget Office, the Federal Reserve, the International Monetary Fund, a couple of banks, OECD. I look at all of them, all about 3.1% for the year with very little difference among them. I think the forecasters are unduly pessimistic. I think there are a number of reasons to expect real GDP growth to be on the high side of any of those forecasts, somewhere about 3.5% or 4%. And for the economy to create somewhere about 2 million jobs this year. Now, what leads me to that kind of optimism? There are a number of indicators that are stronger than any of the forecasters are currently saying, are currently incorporating into their forecasts. These include things like we've had decreases in unemployment claims, unemployment rates. We've had extremely low interest rates. Everybody's aware of that, especially the banking community. But we've also seen declines in the delinquency rates on home mortgages, credit card debt, commercial and industrial loans. And those decreases in delinquency rates are a really, really good thing. We've also seen very strong corporate earnings, and especially from some key kind of leading indicators like in the transportation sector. The railroads are coming in very strong, which indicates that shipments are up, and that's a very good leading indicator. There are, however, a number of things that are kind of disturbing, some trends and events that we can talk about. One is that we have no leading sector coming out of this recession. In the 80s, we had the personal computer boom. In the 90s, a much broader high-tech boom. In the early 2000s, housing let us out. We do not have a leading sector in the economy right now. The second thing that's a little bit disturbing is the labor market. At the peak of the recession, we had lost 8 million jobs. We're down to about 7.2 million. If we create a couple of 100,000 jobs a month, and last month we created 216,000, we will still not have the same number of jobs in the U.S. economy as we did at the beginning of the recession in December of '07 until sometime early in 2014. And that's a really disturbing kind of trend. And 200,000 a month for any extended period of time is really good job growth. Excess reserves are still excessive. There's no other way to look at it. For 20 years before the start of this recession, the nation's banks kept about $2 billion in excess reserves. Excess reserves are funds that they could loan but have not. As of April the 20th, we had $1.47 trillion in excess reserves. And that's a very disturbing sign. It's a sign that the banking community is not lending. That's not a slam on the banking community. It takes two to make a loan. You have to have qualified buyers walk in the door to make the loan. Housing is not fixed by any means. It simply isn't fixed. We had small increases in March in new starts and existing home sales, but those are small increases off of 50-year record lows. The most commonly used housing price index continues to fall. We're not out of the housing problem yet. Oil prices, as you know, have been rising. $112 yesterday afternoon, and oil prices have been tracking the run-up in oil prices in 2008 for the last several months almost exactly. And a lot of people are worried that oil prices are going to put a damper on economic growth this year. What I really expect to see is volatility. And if you look at the history of oil prices over the last 10 years, I would bet on a lot of ups and downs, not on continued price increases. State and local government is still a drag on the economy. There are still 42 or 43 states that had budget decreases for the coming year. That means, as in New Mexico, and I'm sure my colleague Chris Erickson will talk about that, we're not going to expand employment for the state and local level. The federal government fiscal battle is far from over, and that could really turn into something nasty. The agreement reached on the FY11 budget is just one of the stepping stones to a fiscal plan that'll work for the country. Okay, those are 7 things that could cause us trouble during the next year. I don't think that any one of those will be sufficient to derail economic growth this year, but some combination of them certainly could. I still come in on the high side of the growth forecasts. I've got to. I'm a Cubs fan and a natural optimist.
We all hope you're right. All right, let's move on now to Dr. Chris Erickson for a closer look at the regional economy. Dr. Erickson.
Thanks, Fred, and thanks to the Chamber and to Bill Allen for having us here today. I really appreciate it. Well, New Mexico is not doing as well as the national economy as a whole. In fact, we have been growing slower, and when you look at the data, what you see is that the main culprit has been the Albuquerque area. Albuquerque is down 1% over the last year. If you were to move Albuquerque out of the numbers, the state would be growing at about 0.8%. As it stands now, the state is essentially flat. That means, if you think about it the other way around, that means everywhere but Albuquerque is doing okay. We're not doing gangbusters, but we're doing okay. Las Cruces did very well going through the recession. In fact, we just got new data from last year, new updated data from last year from the state, and we actually did better last year than we thought we had. The data was revised up, and that indicates that before we were saying we had 6 straight months of growth. It turned out to be 11 straight months of growth last year. Now, as it turns out, this month, the latest data shows us at flat, not having any growth. But still, when you compare Las Cruces to the rest of the country, we've done quite well. In fact, if you look at some data, if you look at what we call gross domestic product for the city, and that's a very comprehensive measure of economic activity, and if you look at that data, for metropolitan areas, you find that Las Cruces between 2001 when the data started and today is ranked 10th among 300 metropolitan areas. And so we're doing quite well here locally. And when you look at the rest of southern New Mexico, we also see that we're doing quite well. For example, at Silver City, you see that the Chino mine has expanded hiring somewhere around 500 to 600 new employees. Those are employees that were laid off previously but are now being rehired. Other parts of southern New Mexico are also doing reasonably well. Where we are seeing problems, and Dr. Peach mentioned this is true nationally, but it's also true here in New Mexico. One of the biggest threats to our local economy, perhaps the biggest threat, is in fact the state budget. State budget cut NMSU this year by 4.9%. Since peak funding in fiscal year 2009, NMSU has been cut 17%. NMSU represents about 20% of the local economy. That's direct and indirect, not just direct employment, but direct and indirect. And so that kind of cut to the NMSU is going to shave about 1% off the growth rate in Doña Ana County and Las Cruces. Also, at the same time, we've seen the positive bump that we got from the expansion of Fort Bliss. And of course, Fort Bliss is in El Paso, but we've had a pretty strong spillover effect from Fort Bliss, and that growth is coming to an end. It's the scheduled redeployments have pretty much already happened, and so we're not going to get much of a shove from that. And so I would say over the next year that Las Cruces is likely to not do as well as we've been doing the last several years. Now, I'm not predicting negative growth. Like Dr. Peach, I'm pretty positive. I think NMSU, I keep saying NMSU, I think Las Cruces will do well this year. I also think NMSU will do well, and I think White Sands is likely to do well too. But there's some negatives on the horizon. If we go out a little bit further, starting in June and then building up as we go out, you have the construction of the new train fueling station in the southern part of the county, and that will be a source of positive growth for our area. And I think that will offset to a large extent the negative impact of state funding. As we talk about the state budget, right now it's projected that funding for next year will increase by about 4 or 4.5%. If that's true, and if that then translates into higher funding for NMSU, that will be a good sign and also will help us to gain some momentum. So overall, I think my outlook is positive but not static. We have some negatives, we have some positives, but I'm looking forward to a growth year.
All right, thank you, Dr. Erickson. We move on now to Dr. Ken Martin for perhaps some of the best news, the financial markets, which are doing pretty good, right? On a roll.
The stock market is on a roll, no doubt about it. At the last economic forum in August of 2010, I noted that the stock market from the lows of March 2009 to August of 2010 was dead on the same as the last really serious recession we had in this country, 1982-83. After their lows, the market in both cases had increased about 65%. It was remarkable how close they looked. And that was August. September is usually a very rocky month in the stock market. Everybody was really nervous about what was happening. But a funny thing happened on the way to the forum, so to speak. This bull market didn't stop. In fact, starting September 1st, it really took off and accelerated. And now we're nearly double where we were at the lows of March 2009. We haven't hardly seen anything like this. It's really been a remarkable run. And the question, of course, is why has this happened? As I noted last time in August, there are vast differences between the economic recovery this time and the economic recovery in 1982-83. Back then, GDP was up much much stronger. Employment was coming back much stronger than it is this time. I mean, so people are asking, what's the deal? Has the market lost its mind? Some people think so. And Dr. Peach enumerated many items that I have on the wall of worry. He had 7, I have 9. One is that the stock market is drastically overvalued. Robert Shiller at Yale University calculates a price-to-earnings ratio, a measure of valuation in the stock market, using 10-year average earnings. And by that measure, the market's price-earnings ratio is about 23. The long-run average is about 16. I mean, it's way above the long-run average. And that's a 100-year average. So he's a little uncomfortable with where the market is, to say the least. The second thing on the wall of worry, the boom in the market has been caused by radically expansionary monetary policy of the Federal Reserve. It's so-called quantitative easing, or QE2 as we call it for short. And there doesn't seem to be any political support for extending this to QE3. Third, budget cutting at the state and local level that Dr. Peach talked about, plus federal budget cuts that are in the works may be sucking the air out of the economy. Also, Standard & Poor's just this week downgraded or put a negative outlook on U.S. debt, and that may accelerate and force the government to further cut the budget and deal with the debt problem, the debt ceiling that's coming up. Fourth, there's geopolitical risk in the Middle East and North Africa that's been in the news. Fifth, there's still an acute risk of default by sovereign debt as countries in Europe. Sixth, oil and food prices are increasing. Seventh, housing market has yet to really recover, and there may be another wave of adjustable mortgage resets coming. Eighth, the economic recovery, while 3% is not bad, that's kind of the long run average, or 3.5% is even better. It's not like recoveries from previous recessions where the annualized growth rates in the economy, I think, are more in the 7-8% kind of range at this stage. And number 9 is we're kind of partying like it's 1937 again. And what I mean is from 1929 to 1933, the economy contracted by 30%, the Great Depression. And the 4 years after that, it grew by 9% a year. Then in 1936, income taxes were raised sharply. Monetary policy was tightened to ward off threatened inflation, sounding much like today's story. And the result was the second part of the Great Depression. So the wall of worry is steep, and markets tend to climb those walls of worry. So warding off the worry, what are the positive things? I mean, there's got to be something the investors are kind of hanging their hat on. So one is that credit conditions are as strong as they've been in the last 4 years. Kind of quick and dirty measure of this is the difference between corporate bond yields and Treasury yields. That difference, tend to call that the risk premium, spiked during the financial crisis. It was just off the charts. And now it's as low as it's been since 2007 and has been falling all spring. Stock market valuation. Not everybody believes Robert Shiller from Yale University. David Bianco, who's the chief U.S. stock strategist at Bank of America Merrill Lynch, is one, for example, who believes that the valuation of the market is actually fairly reasonable and is likely to go up. Third, the technical factors in the stock market. The stocks that have been leading the market include some that are very sensitive to consumer spending. We tend to think when we hear the drumbeat of bad news and the wall of worry that consumers are just beat down. But you know what? They're out there spending at Abercrombie and Fitch, Ann Taylor. And real estate companies like CB Richard Ellis, those stocks have been leading the market. Some of these are kind of held up by buyout speculation, not those that I don't think that I mentioned, but some of those that are leading the market. But buyout speculation in itself kind of reflects the increased risk appetite in corporate America. And we know corporate America has lots and lots of cash on the balance sheet. Witness AT&T's announcement to intend to buy T-Mobile. And so they have cash to put to work, and they're starting to do that. Dr. Peach mentioned railroad stocks. So the fourth item on warding off worry is that railroad stocks have been market leaders, offering credence to this general global recovery. And the fifth thing that I have on my warding off the wall of worry is an index called the Pulse of Commerce Index that's put out by UCLA and Ceridian. This measures diesel fuel consumption, and that indicator has recently accelerated. So it ties into railroad stocks doing well. And that acceleration in that index has been documented to be tightly correlated with stock prices. So, there's no one key to the market. No one person has the key to the stock market, but it seems like the best lock-picking tools that are out there indicate that the big one that we're all worried about is not quite here.
Okay, Dr. Martin, thank you so much. Great insights today, and we're going to have some insights from our audience now. We're moving to the section of our program where we have audience questions for our experts. So we'll ask those of you who have questions to come to one of the mics, and you can be at both mics, and we'll get to as many questions as possible during this section of our program. And, to give some perspective to this, national perspective to this, a new poll from CBS News and the New York Times gives a sense of what the average person in this country thinks about the economy. They do these polls on a regular basis. They're national, they're random, so they only have a margin of error of plus or minus 3%. And in this recent poll, 80% of people polled said the economy is in bad shape. Perhaps that's not too surprising. In fact, that number has been pretty steady over the last year. But here's the other number that has a lot of people worried in the same poll. 39% of people said the economy is getting worse. That's the highest it's been in this poll in a year. In fact, a year ago, only 15% of people polled said the economy was getting worse. We have our first question right now from an audience member. Thanks for joining us. Your name and question.
Thanks, Fred. I'm Lloyd Covens. I'm a student. Dr. Peach, you mentioned almost 1.5 trillion in bank reserves. Is there a point, housing aside, where government policy or government intervention can begin to move those funds with some kind of heading towards various preferred industries?
No. Federal Reserve policy could reduce the amount that is in excess reserves in any number of ways. In some ways, it is related to the quantitative easing program that the Fed has right now, and they are deliberately trying to make sure that the banking system has a lot of liquidity and the ability to lend, but they can't in any way force banks to lend. Banks need viable customers to walk in the door. Can they reduce it? Yes. Can they get rid of it overnight? Absolutely not. It's a reflection of markets.
I was talking to some local bankers just this week about this issue, and I asked them about why it was that they had such a backlog of excess reserves, and their answer was the customers, qualified customers, are not walking through the door, and of course, qualified is the key attribute. It's easy to find people who want to borrow money. It's hard to find people who want to borrow money or qualify. You also have some administrative types of constraints that have been put on the banks by the FDIC and other regulators who are trying to avoid, with good reason, the kind of excessive lending that we saw during the subprime mortgage bubble. And so I think that those two things are what are pushing banks back, pushing banks back from further lending and from working those excess reserves down. The one other thing I'd like to point out too is that if those excess reserves are worked down too quickly, that is, if banks expand their lending too quickly, the result will be inflation, and we have to be very careful about that. The specter of inflation over the next year is very modest. The specter of inflation over the next 5 years is more extreme, and I'd be surprised if we didn't get a pretty sharp increase in inflation over the next decade.
And I wanted to ask you real quickly, you mentioned the drop from the military side and kind of a flattening at NMSU. Can you comment at all on our agricultural outlook for the region?
Well, the agricultural, of course, we just got off a fantastic ag year, one of the best years we've had. Chili production was down, but production and market value and other crops were up sharply. And so that's been very good. And I suspect we will not have as good a year this year, given that we're coming off of such a good year. The one issue, the big issue we have here in Las Cruces is that there's a shortage of water currently, and that shortage of irrigation water may have a negative impact on crop yields this year.
I just wanted to chime in on that. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal recently about the pecan crop, and that China has become a huge consumer of pecans, and the price of pecans has gone up dramatically, which is going to help the pecan industry in New Mexico. And I don't know how far out that's going, but the prices are going in the right direction.
Just another reminder of our truly global economy, for sure. And let's all hope we get some rain on your point as well soon. Another question.
My name is Robert Ramsey. I'm an alumni from New Mexico State. But one night, last night I was listening to the news, and they mentioned the unemployment rate right now it looks good for New Mexico. And then I think someone made a comment, and it was sort of a negative comment. It's like, well, it's seasonal. But I'd like to know just how our unemployment rate in comparison national.
Yeah, the state unemployment rate right now is 8.1%. It dropped it had the sharpest drop of any state last month.
Right.
So we did better than any state in terms of improvement. However, you got to always take the unemployment rate with a grain of salt, because often what it reflects is not people who are finding jobs, but people who are giving up on finding jobs.
Okay.
And so when people stop looking for work, they cease being unemployed, using the definition that economists use, okay. Which is that you're looking for work but haven't found it. And so, yes, it's good that the unemployment rate has declined, but I will say when you look at the numbers, it's really driven by a decline in the number of people looking for work, not people finding jobs.
Okay, and we're going to continue with our questions from the audience. Picking up on this point, though, Dr. Peach, I have to ask you about this. I think it's an often overlooked issue when we talk about the labor market. Beyond the fact that we haven't come close to replacing the number of jobs that we've lost, I want your thoughts on the number of jobs that we've created, as well as, most importantly, the quality of those jobs, because statistics are showing disproportionate growth in jobs that pay less than $15 an hour. So even though there is some job growth, what about the quality of those jobs?
That's correct. The growth in the labor market has been at the low end of the wage spectrum. I am an optimist, but the situation is really worse than that. except for one thing. The one thing that's bright here is that we've had tremendous increases in productivity. During the fourth quarter of 2010, we reached the same level of real GDP that we had in the fourth quarter of '07 before the recession started. We're producing the same amount of goods and services with about 7 million fewer employees. That represents a fairly dramatic increase in overall productivity.
And certainly I'm sure that's part of the bright news for earnings and for stock market growth, but what about for workers? That's what I think.
It's terrible for workers. We still have 14 million people who are unemployed by the usual definition, plus another 10 million people who are working part-time who, when they are asked, would prefer to be working full-time. So we've got 24 million people underemployed. But when I say it's worse, we are really entering our second decade of mediocre growth in the labor market. Since 1999, we've really had just mediocre increases in the number of jobs that we've had. And that's a really disturbing kind of trend.
Yeah.
If we get 2 million this year, that'll be great. But as I said, it still takes till 2014 to get us the same number of jobs we had in 2007 without taking into account the fact that we generally generate about 1 million, 1.2 million a year.
Thank you so much for that. Some real context in an issue where we don't get enough context, important to so many people in this country right now. Another question from our audience.
I'm Dennis Clayson. Recently, Standard & Poor's issued a warning that they might find it necessary to downgrade U.S. debt. I'm puzzled because these were the same people that bundled all sorts of toxic mortgages and classified them as AAA debt. So I have no idea what to make of Standard & Poor's announcement. Could you enlighten me?
Sure, I make very little of it. Number one, as you pointed out, they've been wrong frequently in the past. Number two is there is no possibility, none, for the government of the United States of America to go bankrupt. We are, unless Congress says we're going to go bankrupt. That's under the control of the people we elected. Now, and it's not really bankrupt. We've been in debt in this country since 1789, since the Constitution went into effect. And it has not meant that the Republic has ended. There's an awful lot of nonsense about that, and sometime I'd like to have a show devoted to the debt and the deficit. One of the things that people do that's absolutely silly is to compare the debt of the federal government to the debt of an individual or to the debt of a corporation. And it is not the same, not even the same as a state. The accounting rules are different to begin with. Corporations, individuals, and even the state that claims to balance its budget each year amortize capital projects over a long term. The federal government does not. When you see the new federal building down there, that was a current expense. No corporation in America would ever make any money if they had to current expense all capital outlays. The other thing that the federal government has that individuals and corporations don't is the ability to tax. You know, if you and I get into debt, we cannot go out and tax the audience here to pay off our new Cadillac or our new fancy house. We don't have that ability. All of this is within control. We can do it. It's absolute silliness. Besides that, the dollar is still the reserve currency of the world. The federal government can issue currency whenever it needs it. There's just so much silliness out there. And among the silliness are the ratings from S&P.
Dr. Erickson, did you have something to say on this too?
Very quickly, I would point out that if you read the U.S. Constitution, I think it's the 14th Amendment, maybe the 13th Amendment, I think, says that the debt of the United States government shall not be questioned once it's been issued by the Congress. That means it's unconstitutional for the U.S. not to pay its debt. By the way, that same amendment also makes it unconstitutional to repay Confederate debt. So if you're still holding your Confederate bonds, you're out of luck. In effect, I think the S&P has no credibility on this issue at all. They've used a TV term. They jumped the shark. They've lost what last shred of credibility they had, in my mind.
We have another question in queue, but to put this issue into perspective from a national standpoint of voters, individuals who were polled by CBS and the New York Times were asked about the decision coming up to raise the debt limit. 63% of people polled, and again, this poll only has a margin of error of 3% plus or minus. 63% of people polled opposed an increase in the federal debt limit. Only 27% supported an increase in the debt limit. And this was the case in terms of opposing and supporting across political lines. Republicans were more likely to oppose, but Democrats as well. 48% opposed raising the debt limit, and 36% of Democrats supported an increase in the debt limit.
Fred,
and yes.
Say one thing real quickly. I wish they had included a question on there that asked people about the difference between the debt and the deficit. And I would suspect that somewhere around that 63% number can't tell you the difference between debt and deficit. Just a thought.
Okay, and then we have a question from Bill Allen, the president of the Greater Las Cruces Chamber of Commerce. Bill?
Thanks. The Las Cruces business community is made up primarily of smaller businesses. You mentioned the new Union Pacific project that's coming up. Can you talk a little bit about how smaller businesses might benefit from a project of that magnitude?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and of course, I have to say that I haven't looked in detail at the contract. But what you do see happening when you have a large project like that coming in, of course, there'll be a lot of specialized contractors will be hired. Those very specialized contractors may be coming from outside the area. But where small businesses really benefit from a project like this is not necessarily in directly doing business with Union Pacific, although of course that would obviously be something to be beneficial for local contractors and local suppliers if they're able to gain contracts with Union Pacific, but also with the fact that you have a sharp increase in spending by the employees who are working for the company, who are going to be doing business with local businesses. One of the criticisms you heard made about the Union Pacific project and is because since it is so close to the border, it's in the southern part of the county, that a lot of the business will be going to El Paso rather here to Las Cruces, and in a direct effect that probably is true. That is a direct spending. A lot of it will be in El Paso rather than here in Las Cruces. But just like with Fort Bliss, it's important for people to remember that there's incredible connectivity between El Paso and Las Cruces. And so the fact that project will boost the El Paso economy will also boost our economy. And the fact that it'll boost our economy will also boost the El Paso economy. And so I think it's going to be a boon. I anticipate it'll add about 1% to county-wide growth. And for those people who can do business directly with the project, I think it'll be even more of a boon for those people.
Okay, and we ask more of our audience members to come forward with their questions as we continue an economic forum from our economist at New Mexico State University, Dr. Jim Peach, Dr. Chris Erickson, and Dr. Ken Martin. And we do have another question. Thank you.
Paul Miller retired. I want to ask Dr. Peach a brief one and then a longer kind of cosmic question. Did the Cubs throw the World Series in 1918 because of low wages?
No, that was the White Sox.
No,
The
1918, it's been in the paper recently. I thought you'd be an expert on that.
No.
No, okay. Okay. My cosmic question. Last September at the Domenici Institute, we had Thomas Honig, who was from the Kansas City, head of Federal Reserve. He said it took a long time to get in our big mess. He said it would take 10 years to get out. 10 years to get out. My question is, can the politicians and the American public exercise the discipline of the long look?
First, I think Honig was about right. In financial crises, generally, it takes longer than the usual recession to get out of it. If we look at when the labor market is about to recover at current rates, that's about 7 years. 10 wouldn't be surprising. So I think it's there. I think what's remarkable about all of this is that we had very strong responses to this recession, both during the last months of the Bush administration, when they went to Congress and Congress passed TARP, and in the early going with the Obama administration and we passed the stimulus bill. Neither one of those were perfect, but we had very strong responses from both Republicans and Democrats there. I don't think, despite the current rhetoric, that either party can afford to be held responsible for throwing the U.S. economy back into another recession. So I'm optimistic about things like that.
Okay, another question.
Hi, my name is Andrea Peterson. I'm a grad student here at NMSU. My question, you brought up China, so my question is in regards to the apparent housing bubble they're having there right now. Apparently they're building 10 new cities a year, and people aren't actually populating these cities. So my question really is, how long can the United States rely on that kind of bubble happening in China when we rely so much on them?
Okay, one of the things that when you look at China that you see is that they have been building a large number of high-end housing, and that high-end housing is not finding a market. At the same time, there's a shortage of low-end housing, and there's a large number of people who go homeless in China as a consequence, or live in homes that are inadequate. If you look at the 10-year plan, which was just released last month, in that 10-year plan, they call on decreasing growth in high-end housing and increasing growth in low-end housing. And that will help to even out this problem. But it also illustrates another issue, another problem with China that we in the United States tend to underestimate, which is China is still, despite strides in recent decades, is still a centrally planned economy. And centrally planned economies have difficulty dealing with situations where they have an inadequate demand in one area and a surplus in another area. And you're seeing higher default rates in China on banking loans. And by the way, the banking sector is controlled by the state. But you're seeing higher defaults in the banking sector in China than we've seen historically. And there's more than one person out there who thinks that China may be in for a correction, a sharp correction, which by Chinese standards may mean zero growth or 3 or 4% growth rather than 10% growth that they've been seeing in recent years. But I agree, if we rely on them to drive our economy, we're exposing ourselves to excess danger.
Along these lines of, gentlemen, does our country have the patience to wait 10 years for a recovery, the long term? I want to start with you, Dr. Peach, because I wonder, here's the issue as I see it, and I look at these numbers. Beyond the fact that the labor market's not so good, and if you lose a job, it may be very long time to get another job, and even if you do, it may not be the same quality job. There's a serious problem for people who are working, many people who are working, even the folks who are the most fortunate, who have fairly good paying jobs. if you look at the last couple of years and taking a look at our local economy, they've had a reduction in take-home pay, perhaps, with an increase in payroll deductions. In the case of many state workers, we're talking about starting this summer a reduction in take-home pay of more than 3%. No raises, so again, we add in a couple of percent that we would normally see for most workers each year. And then we add in inflation, and we've got, in the last year, about 3%. Go for a couple of years, and we're talking maybe 5%. Add that up, that's 15 to 17% that these folks are behind in only a few years. Dr. Peach.
Well, first, on the patience of the American public and the political system, we typically hold presidents and sometimes Congress responsible for things that they shouldn't be responsible for. And we give them credit as well. Jimmy Carter clearly went down to Ronald Reagan in 1980 in part because of economic conditions, and he was hardly responsible for high oil prices. Bill Clinton ran in 1992 with the famous phrase of, "It's the economy, stupid." And he was absolutely correct. And so the first George Bush became unemployed, in a sense, over economic issues. And we do this throughout history. So we may see some changes. I think what we saw this last year in the congressional races in part reflected the condition of the economy, and we may see it again. But on the major issues, I think both parties will ultimately respond to this. You and I, we may not be so patient, but we have been unwilling in our system to address a problem of growing inequality, and that's been a 30-year issue. That's not an issue just of the last 2 or 3 years. We need to address that. We need to have a national energy policy. We need to do something about education. Those are the long-run growth things. We need to fix health. Those are the long-run things that are going to make the economy grow. And in the current environment, there's not much prospect that we're going to do much about any of those.
Yeah, well, Jim and I used to argue a lot about income inequality, and Jim has convinced me that it is a major problem and it's something we're not dealing with. And it is, we've seen, for example, stagnation in the middle class in the United States in the last 20 years. I think the number is that we've had 1% growth in the median income in the United States in the last 20 years compared to a much higher number for people who are in the upper end of income. And this is very typical kind of situation you see when an economy moves from, when an economy suffers institutional changes. During the Industrial Revolution we saw this, during electrification in the early part of the 20th century saw this, and now with the advent of computers and the internet, we're seeing it again. But just because we can understand it and we understand what's causing it doesn't mean that we should be tolerant of it. It means that we need to come up with ways to get around this problem. It's inherent in the marketplace. People who have skills that are in high demand, who work in high tech and in computers, they're doing very well, thank you. People with less high demand skills, high school graduates, high school dropouts, even some people who graduate from college who aren't in technical fields, they're finding that they're having a difficult time getting ahead. And if we can come up with means to help those people, I think we'll do a lot better. One of those, for example, would be funding higher education so that people can get the skills that are in demand in our new economy.
Okay, and Dr. Martin.
A slightly different take on the question is to think about how technology has changed our collective, or has sped up our collective lives and our individual lives. I mean, I remember getting the first microwave oven, and you punch the button And you can, why isn't this getting hotter sooner or faster? Come on. And now we have connected devices connected to the internet. And why isn't my download coming faster, kind of thing. And so it seems collectively are more impatient. Part of the impatience that I have kind of observed over the last, I would say 20 or 30 years also, is the impatience with respect to the stuff we can buy. And I mean, cars and houses and technology gadgets that we can buy, and how that was financed. Much of that was financed with debt on individual levels. We were in a debt super cycle as a country, as individuals, and that has come to an end. And so how we deal with the end of using your house as an ATM, for example, is going to say a lot about the character of our country and whether we are patient enough to wait the 10 or longer years in order to fix or rectify these problems.
Okay, and we might have time for one more question if someone else in the audience has one. While we wait for that, Dr. Peach, I've got to say here, though, we haven't talked specifically about this yet, but two of the things that folks have to buy, and I think maybe this is part of what we're seeing in the CBS News, New York Times poll about consumer sentiment, and 39% of folks polled saying things are getting worse. Two of the things that folks have to buy, gasoline and food, are two of the areas where we've seen the biggest increases, and I think there is a lot of fear we're going to see more of that down the line. Dr. Peach, will that be a serious threat? I know it was one in your list, but on its own, I wonder, could it be enough to set us back into recession?
Oh, I don't think so this time. There are three things. Number one, this economy is much less dependent on oil than it was 25 or 30 years ago. Per dollar of GDP, economists do a measure called energy intensity, and it's the amount of oil it takes to produce a dollar of GDP, and that's gone way down. We are much more efficient. Even from the consumer aspect, the expenditures on gasoline and transportation are a smaller portion of the consumer budget than they were 25 years ago.
So you're not concerned, though, that that's not going to translate into higher prices beyond food, a lot of other consumer products?
Sure. There's no doubt that if you increase the price of oil and you increase the price of diesel, food prices have to go up a little bit because farmers use a lot of diesel and getting it to market.
And of course, everything's in a truck coming to the stores.
But everybody kind of assumes that oil prices go only in one direction, and they don't. If you look at the history of it, what you see is volatility. And we are as likely to see a big decline in oil prices in the next year as we are big increases.
Boy, I hope you're right.
Now, in July '08, if you have time for a little bit of memory here, in early July we reached $147 oil. Okay, by December it was 40. Okay, in July '08, T. Boone Pickens said we'd have $200 oil in December of that year.
Interesting.
So don't
I
take
hope
all
you're
that
right.
too
And I have an
seriously.
economy car, so I mean, I ought to be okay up here, but I'm worried.
You can buy an electric car, one of those coal-burning cars.
We have one more question.
Dr. Peach, you said earlier that we didn't have an industry leading us out of this recession. Is that necessarily a bad thing?
Typically, we have an industry that does that. Historically, in the 20th century, housing was that industry. In the 80s, it was something else. In the 90s, something else. But in the early 2000s, it was a housing boom again. And we don't have it. So if you want the kind of growth rates that we typically have coming out of a recession, I think you have to have a leading sector of some sort, and we don't have it here.
Dr. Martin.
Let me pitch in on that and tie into kind of Dr. Erickson's comment before about technology. This may not be the kind of industry that, I don't know, like manufacturing, but the mobile internet tsunami, if you will, is going to dramatically and has dramatically already changed how we live life and how we do our jobs. And I think that's going to continue and going to accelerate. And so those individuals who are connected and understand how to leverage that connectivity are going to do well.
Dr. Martin, you mentioned earlier the Wall Street Journal, and one other point on this that relates to the economy and jobs that I have to ask you about. They did an amazing article recently, you may have read it, about the fact that over the 10-year period between 2000 and 2009, multinationals eliminated millions of jobs in the United States while creating millions overseas. In the last 40 seconds, does this trend worry you long term?
Well, sure. I mean, naturally, it's going to be an issue, I mean, especially for those who have lost their jobs as a result of that. But we are a creative, optimistic society. At least I hope we continue to be that way. And if we can, a challenge of losing a job, I mean, is certainly a challenge, but it can also be an opportunity. And the future, I think, is there with the mobile internet and all of that entails.
Good to end on a positive note. Let's be optimistic amid all of this. I'm Fred Martino. Thank you so much for joining us. And again, thank you to our members who make local programming possible.